Hello everyone, welcome back. When you think of Sparta, you probably imagine shining armor, perfect warriors, and marble temples. But the truth feels different. Stone walls that sweat in the summer, freeze in the winter, and meals so small they barely feed a child. Discipline here isn't noble. It's more like living with hunger as your closest companion. And the myths of glory, they look a lot less impressive once you're staring into an empty dinner bowl. Before we dive in, hit like and subscribe to join our global community. Wherever you're watching from, drop your city and your local time in the comments. It's how we turn history into a conversation that belongs to all of us. Headphones on, symmetry achieved, underwear secured. Congratulations, you're officially ready for history our way. Our journey begins with a simple question. Would you even survive your first day? You arrive not as a soldier, not even as a child in training. You arrive as an infant. In Sparta, that means your body is inspected by men who are not your family. They check the shape of your limbs, the strength of your cries, and whether you look like a person who might one day hold a shield. If you do not meet their quiet standards, you are left outside, on a hillside in the cold. The word they used was exposure, which sounds almost gentle, like air touching skin. But what it meant was abandonment. So the first reason you would hate being a Spartan is simple. You might not even be allowed to be one. Suppose you pass, you grow, you survive, but survival is thin. You are given one cloak a year, not a wardrobe, not even two, just one. It becomes your blanket, your bedding, your disguise, your comfort, and eventually, your smell. Washing is rare, and the cloak grows stiff before it grows warm. When you think of glory, you imagine polished bronze. What you get is a wool garment that never leaves you, itching in the heat, freezing in the rain. If you hate laundry now, you would hate being a Spartan far more. By the time you're old enough to eat at the communal table, the syssitia, you begin to learn what it means to belong. Everyone brings a contribution. Grain, wine, meat. If you cannot contribute, you cannot sit. And if you cannot sit, you are not a citizen anymore. That is how thin the line is. One meal, one missing portion, and you fall from belonging to nothing. This is not a banquet hall with music. This is black broth, the liquid that was famous for ending appetites, rather than satisfying them. Pig's blood, vinegar, salt, boiled until it looks like a shadow in the bowl. Older men said it kept them strong. Foreign guests said it was inedible. If you asked for honey or cheese, you would be laughed at, or worse, considered soft. Hunger was not your enemy. Choice was. You think food might be your escape, but the state makes even hunger into discipline. Boys in the Agoge are deliberately underfed. The idea is that you will learn to steal. But if you are caught, the punishment is not for theft. It is for being clumsy enough to get caught. Imagine being whipped not because you broke a rule, but because you failed an unwritten test of cunning. That is how you grow here, by learning that rules do not always mean what they say. And if you hate mixed signals now, you would hate being a Spartan child. Pause for a moment and breathe in the barracks. The air is dry, full of wool grease and smoke from the last cooking fire. You lie beside other boys on reeds that are not replaced often, and you wonder if tomorrow's test will be hunger, or cold, or silence. Discipline is not a single act here. It is the absence of comfort, repeated so many times it becomes invisible. So far you have learned 3 things. That your life begins with inspection, that your body is dressed in one unchanging cloak, and that your hunger is a lesson instead of a problem. If you are thinking this does not sound like a heroic story, it is because that story was never written for you. It was written for the city that owned you. Even the act of eating together is not really about food. The syssitia binds men into groups where loyalty is measured not in affection, but in contribution. If you miss your share once, they remember. If you miss twice, they expel you. Exile begins at the table, and the broth, Always the broth sits as a reminder that belonging tastes like iron and vinegar. No spices, no relief. Just the assurance that your discomfort is shared, and therefore correct. It is easy to imagine that you could adapt. People adapt to anything, they say, but adaptation here means shrinking yourself into the outline they already drew. You are not meant to stand out. You are meant to last, and lasting is not the same as living. You would hate being a Spartan because every softness is a suspicion. Every comfort is a weakness. Even your first cry as a baby is not your own. It belongs to a committee of men who decide whether the sound is strong enough to justify keeping you alive. You wake each morning to routine that is not yours. The rhythm is set by the city, not by desire. There are no private schedules. No one asks if you slept well. Sleep is simply the gap between orders. In the barracks, your body is less a person than a tool waiting to be used. What you eat does not fill you. What you wear does not comfort you. What you learn is not how to read or calculate, but how to endure. Literacy is scarce, almost discouraged. A song might be allowed if it praised war. A poem might be repeated if it taught obedience. If you craved more, you kept it hidden. You would hate being a Spartan because curiosity itself could look suspicious. And when you thought the punishments might ease, they did not. Whippings were common, not always tied to a crime. Sometimes they came as part of a ritual, like at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where youths were flogged before an audience. Some endured until their bodies gave out. The crowd admired the silence more than the strength. If you could not stay silent, you failed. To hurt was normal. To react was weakness. You might have hated that most of all. Even the smallest details were inverted. Wealth was deliberately stripped of use. Iron bars were said to be the currency, heavy and rusted, so that greed could not travel far. Imagine your wages paid in chunks of metal, so bulky you could barely carry them. You could not hide them. You could not exchange them abroad. If you hated coins slipping through your fingers, here you would hate the opposite, wealth that bruised your arms just to hold. There were moments when the absurdity almost revealed itself. A feast without flavour, a punishment without crime, a coin that could not buy. But those moments did not belong to you. They belonged to the city that told you every discomfort had a purpose. And perhaps that was the sharpest edge of all, that you did not own your own misery. Still, the most unnerving part was not what you suffered, but what others suffered for you. The helots worked the land. They outnumbered you, vastly. They ploughed, harvested, carried, baked, and every Spartan knew they might rebel. So the city responded with the cryptire, young men sent out at night, armed, sometimes barefoot, ordered to kill helots considered dangerous. It was called a rite of passage, but it was also a license for fear. Imagine growing up knowing that your safety was balanced on the constant terror of those beneath you. If you hated living with guilt that never left, you would hate being a Spartan most of all. The cryptire did not sleep in beds. They wandered fields, hid in ditches, learned to live without fire or shoes. The training was meant to harden them, but it also revealed the truth. Even the so-called rulers were trapped by the same system. To dominate meant also to be deformed by discipline. You could not escape it. You could only enforce it, and the irony stood quietly in the background. While men lived in barracks, stripped of comfort, women in Sparta could hold land, inherit estates, manage property. A wife might own more than her husband, might be freer in economy than he was in body. This was not liberation by design. It was imbalance created by obsession with war. Yet it meant that in the one Greek city most famed for hardness, the women carried softer freedoms than the men. If you expected pride in that, what you found instead was strangeness. To live as a man here was to be less free than a woman outside. You would hate being a Spartan because nothing matched expectation. Glory was hunger, wealth was iron, power was fear, and freedom was found only by those the system pretended to exclude. The nights were the same as the days, unbending. You wrapped yourself in the one cloak, listened to the reed mat crack, and wondered if tomorrow's lesson would be to endure cold, or to endure silence, or to endure the knowledge that your life belonged to a city that demanded more than you had. Somewhere far away, Athens was carving statues, trading wine, writing plays. Here, your greatest act of culture was to chew without complaint, and perhaps that is the simplest answer. You would hate being a Spartan not because it was unbearable, but because it was so deliberately empty, a life designed to erase the idea of choice itself. When you think of childhood, you might imagine play. In Sparta, play was disguised as discipline, wrestling in the dirt, running with bare feet over stones, sparring until bruises formed. These were not pastimes, they were lessons. And lessons were not meant to be enjoyable. You would hate being a Spartan, because even your games were tests you could fail. The Agoge was less a school than a narrowing corridor. Each year, it took away more. A softer bed, a heavier burden, a stricter watch. The boys who excelled did not shine by knowledge, but by silence. The teachers admired hunger, because it sharpened. They admired pain, because it hardened. What they did not admire was comfort. If you wanted comfort, you were in the wrong city. Food never ceased to remind you of that. Black broth, the famous dish, appeared again and again. A liquid so stark that even Spartan elders admitted it was an acquired taste. Foreigners tasted it once and shook their heads. One story says a visiting king spat it out and remarked that no wonder Spartans were eager to die. They ate this every day. The Spartans took the joke as praise. You would take it as a warning. Meals were more than meals. They were auditions for belonging. Each citizen had to bring his share of supplies to the mess hall. Fail once, and your companions grew suspicious. Fail twice, and you lost the right to sit with them. No table meant no status. A cloak could mark you, a shield could protect you, but only food could keep you inside the circle. In a place where war was constant, exclusion from dinner was deadlier than any wound. You would hate being a Spartan, because your survival depended not on honour, but on barley and blood soup. Think of the cloak again, that one garment per year. It grew old with you, stiff with sweat and smoke. In summer, it suffocated. In winter, it failed to warm. It itched. It reeked. It was never new. Some said this was a lesson to remind you that the body should not care for comfort. But after weeks, months, years, you would begin to wonder if the lesson was ever meant to end. And still the city asked more. The cryptire waited for you when you were older. At night you would be sent to watch the helots, the enslaved people who fed the land. They worked in fields that were not theirs, lived in houses that were never safe, and carried the constant fear of sudden violence. Every year, the Spartan state declared war on them, not against foreign armies, but against its own labourers. It was a ritual, a license to kill. If you thought war was only with enemies, you would hate discovering that here. It was also with neighbours. Imagine wandering barefoot in the dark, hungry, ordered to hide by day and prowl by night. Your task not to fight but to stalk. This was called training. But it was also terror. To grow into a citizen meant growing into someone who lived on fear. Fear of helots rising, fear of hunger returning, fear of weakness being noticed. That is not a life you would choose. The irony continued. Women whom other Greek cities treated as shadows in the home, here owned land, commanded estates, and spoke with a freedom Spartan men rarely enjoyed. While you lived with a single cloak, a single meal, and a single duty, your sister or your wife might inherit fields, run households, and move with more ease in public. The state had stripped you of softness so thoroughly that women stood outside its frame, freer not by kindness, but by neglect. You would hate realizing that your city prized your obedience more than your life, but prized their property more than either. Every rule pressed you further inward. No gold, no silver. Just iron bars too heavy to hide. No songs of love. No stories of heroes beyond the state. Just chants of obedience. No escape in travel. No trade with neighbours. Just the walls and the fields. If you hated feeling trapped in your own room, you would hate Sparta with every breath. At night, the silence was full of weight. You lay on reeds, wrapped in the same cloak, stomach never quite full. The darkness hummed with the thought of helots outside, soldiers beside you, and the state above all of it. Even in sleep, you did not belong to yourself. You belonged to Sparta, and perhaps that is the clearest reason. You would hate being a Spartan because nothing in your life was yours. Not your body at birth, not your hunger as a boy, not your cloak as a man, not even your fear at night. All of it was borrowed by the city, and all of it could be taken back at any moment. By now you see the shape of the city. It is not made of marble arches or wide plazas. It is made of rules, stitched tighter than your one cloak, binding you into a pattern you cannot slip out of. From the first day of your life to the last day of your strength, Sparta whispers the same lesson. You belong to it, not to yourself. Think again of that first moment, your body held in someone else's hands, weighed, judged, perhaps discarded. It is not a family decision. It is the city deciding if you deserve to be alive. If you passed that first test, you carried it like a shadow. Your existence was conditional, and conditional existence never feels like safety. You would hate knowing you survived not because you were loved, but because you were useful. Childhood is supposed to be the soft season, the time of play and mistakes. In Sparta, mistakes are studied and punished. You are fed just enough to stay restless. You steal bread because you must, and if you are caught, you are beaten. Not because stealing is wrong, but because being caught is shameful. Every bruise tells you that hunger is not your enemy. Carelessness is. That is how you grow, teaching yourself that pain is ordinary, and tenderness is suspect. By adolescence, you are less a person than an unfinished soldier. The Agoge trains you not in letters, not in music, not in trade, but in silence and endurance. You march barefoot, even on stone. You sleep on reeds, even in winter. You are ordered to answer questions with brevity so sharp it cuts. Conversation becomes a contest of shortness, as if too many words would make you weak. If you hated small talk, here you would hate even silence, because silence itself was turned into discipline. Food is no escape. The black broth follows you everywhere, ladled out in bowls that stain the lips with iron. Outsiders gag at the taste. Spartans insist it is strength boiled into liquid. You cannot complain, not when everyone else is swallowing the same bitterness. The meal is not nourishment. It is proof that you can share misery and call it unity. And if you cannot share it, if you cannot bring your share to the Syssitia, you lose more than a seat. You lose citizenship. A meal can take away the very name Spartan. If you hate bureaucracy today, imagine one ladle of soup deciding whether you belong to a nation. Clothing is not escape either. The same cloak year after year, until the wool stiffens with sweat and rain, until the smell settles into your skin. You learn to carry cold as if it were furniture. You learn to ignore the itch as if it were language. You learn that your body is not yours to comfort. If you dream of softness, you hide it. If you dream of warmth, you wake colder than before. You would hate being a Spartan because comfort was not lost accidentally. It was denied deliberately. And when you grow into a young man, thinking perhaps you will now taste freedom, the city hands you the cryptire. Nights in the fields, barefoot without shelter, hunting the helots who outnumber you. You are ordered to kill not in battle, but in secret. Not against enemies, but against neighbours. The rite is called training, but it is also fear sculpted into a ritual. You learn to live by watching others live in terror. You would hate realising that your safety depends not on courage, but on cruelty rehearsed. The helots carry the weight of the system. They plough the earth, harvest the grain, fill the bowls of broth. They are the invisible foundation of your life. And because they are the majority, you are taught to fear them constantly. The state declares war on them annually, just to keep the license alive. Imagine waking each morning in a house built on that kind of dread. Every loaf of bread reminds you of a pair of eyes that had to lower in submission so you could eat. That is not strength. That is dependency, dressed up as discipline. Meanwhile, the absurd imbalance plays out at home. Spartan women own land, inherit estates, manage wealth. They move with a freedom that men in the barracks do not have. While you sleep on reeds, your sister might inspect the harvest. While you march barefoot, your mother might own more than your commander. This is not generosity. It is the side effect of a system that hollowed men into soldiers and left property in other hands. Still, the result is the same. You are less free than those the rest of Greece assumed were less free than you. If you hated contradiction, this one would gnaw at you for life. Even wealth is stripped of meaning. Gold and silver are banned. You are handed iron bars so heavy they cannot travel. To buy anything beyond the walls is impossible. To hide wealth is laughable. To hoard it is a punishment in itself. Your purse bruises you. Your pockets sag. You are rich only in the weight of metal no one else desires. You would hate that too, the way ambition was flattened into a lump of rust. Day and night, the same rhythm repeats. Rise when told, eat what is given. Speak as little as possible, march, train, obey. No plays, no statues, no theatres like Athens, no bright markets like Corinth. Just barracks and fields, and the heavy silence of a city that wanted to be hard, and so became hollow. Even joy was rationed, like barley. Even grief had to be silent. And when you lie down again on reeds that never soften, wrapped in a cloak that no longer warms, you realise the truth. This is not glory. It is not even survival. It is surrender to a system that stripped everything human and called the remainder strength. You would hate being a Spartan because nothing here belongs to you. Not your birth, not your hunger, not your bed, not your wealth, not even your fear. All of it belongs to Sparta, and Sparta does not share. So you turn in the dark, listening to the silence that pretends to be order. And you know what every Spartan knew but never said aloud. The city was strong only because it convinced you to be weak. And that, quietly, is why you would hate being a Spartan. You do not begin this part of life at home. You begin it in the Agoge, the state's training system, the place where your childhood is peeled away until there is nothing left but endurance. At 7 years old, you leave your family. You may have a mother who owns land. You may have a father who tells you stories of ancestors, but none of that matters now. The city claims you fully. The barracks are not decorated. They are not softened for children. You sleep in groups on reeds, sometimes pulled from riverbeds still damp. You eat what is given, and it is never enough. The hunger is not an oversight, it is the lesson. The teachers watch you become thin, restless, cunning. You're expected to steal food, but only carefully. If you succeed, no one asks where it came from. If you fail, you are beaten for being careless. The lesson is not morality, the lesson is efficiency. There is a story told again and again of a boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. The animal clawed at his stomach, tore his flesh, but he stayed silent. When he was discovered, he was already dying from the wound, but he had not cried out. That was the ideal, not the theft itself, not the survival of the animal, but the silence of the boy. You would hate being a Spartan, because even death was measured in obedience. Day after day, the Agoge trims away the human edges. You are taught not to ask questions, not to argue, not to crave comfort. You are taught brevity in speech, not because it is polite, but because too many words smell of weakness. A single phrase is considered stronger than a full explanation. Some adults praise the style, call it laconic wit. But you know the truth. It is economy, born from fear of saying too much. Your body learns too. Fighting drills are constant. Wrestling, striking, enduring blows, holding formation. There are no soft breaks, no gentle games. Your play is bruises. Your reward is a night with less pain than usual. You carry on because everyone around you carries on. The city calls it education. You would call it attrition. And when you reach adolescence, there is the ritual at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Boys lined up, stripped, whipped in front of an audience. The blows fall until the skin tears, sometimes until the body fails. The crowd watches for silence. The priestesses preside, as if pain itself were an offering. It is said that some died there, not as punishment, but as ceremony. To them, this was proof of devotion. To you, it would be a nightmare, masquerading as worship. The cruelty is not always grand. Sometimes it is casual. Teachers strike you with rods if your posture falters. Peers challenge you to contests that end with bloodied noses, bruised ribs. An elder might test you with riddles, designed not to spark curiosity, but to expose hesitation. Every moment is a rehearsal for a life where hesitation can cost the city its illusion of strength. You would hate being a Spartan because your life is never just your own performance. It is always an audition for someone else's approval. Yet in the middle of all this, the absurdity creeps in. The Agoge does not train you for trade or poetry or building ships. You are not taught to farm. That belongs to the helots. You are not taught to craft goods. That belongs to foreigners. You are trained only for war. And yet the wars are not constant. So years of your life pass in hunger, in drills, in silence, preparing for battles that may never come. And when they do, they are not always glorious. They are sometimes short, sometimes clumsy, sometimes forgotten. You would hate realizing that you spent your youth bruised and starved for victories that history barely bothers to record. By the time you're nearly grown, the lessons are carved into your bones. You answer in single words. You eat without expecting fullness. You lie on reeds without expecting sleep. And when the cryptire calls you to prowl the night, you do not ask why. You already know the city does not need your question. It only needs your obedience. If this sounds bleak, it is because it was designed to be. The Agoge was not meant to raise children. It was meant to break them down and rebuild them into echoes of the city. And if you think you could resist, remember, the punishment for resistance was not just pain, it was shame. And shame in Sparta was heavier than any iron coin. You would hate being a Spartan, not because the drills were endless, but because the drills never had an end. They were your life, and your life was not yours. You grow older, but the city does not relax its grip. If anything, it tightens. The Agoge has finished shaping you. But now comes the test of whether you can serve not just as a soldier, but as a shadow. The cryptire waits. It is described as a kind of secret police, but in practice it is more like an initiation into cruelty. You are sent into the countryside, barefoot, sometimes without food, sometimes without a cloak, ordered to survive as much on cunning as on strength. The mission sounds vague. Watch the helots, intimidate them, kill the ones who seem bold, and so you prowl the fields at night, crouching in ditches, listening for movement. You strike not in battle, but in darkness. The helot may be unarmed, he may be asleep. It does not matter. The city told you it was necessary. You do it because the city told you to. You would hate being a Spartan because survival here requires becoming something you never asked to be, the instrument of fear. The knights of the cryptire carve themselves into you. Your feet crack against the frost. Your stomach knots with hunger. You learn to sleep on bare ground, to hide at the sight of a torch, to think of every shadow as both enemy and cover. It is not glory. It is suspicion made into routine. And suspicion, once learned, never leaves. Even in daylight, you find yourself glancing over your shoulder, waiting for an order that may never come. At the same time, you are reminded that the kings of Sparta, the very men who rule, are trapped in their own way. Sparta kept two kings at once, a double monarchy. They were meant to balance each other, one leading in war, the other guiding in peace. But peace was rare, and politics never silent. Imagine dining as a king, but only on the same black broth as soldiers, seated at the same table, watched as carefully as they watched each other. If you thought royalty came with freedom, Sparta would prove you wrong. Even crowns were rationed here. One king might march to battle, yet he returned to find the other had stripped his decisions bare. One might whisper alliances, yet the council could overrule him. Authority was heavy, but not stable. And so even at the top, even in the highest seat, you found yourself controlled. You would hate being a Spartan king because the throne was not a gift. It was another cage, only taller. Meanwhile, stories of individual Spartans became more like warnings than inspirations. There was the soldier who endured wounds without crying out, celebrated not for bravery, but for silence. There was the youth who starved quietly, praised because he did not ask for more. There was the king who led a battle, only to return home censured for the way he spent his men. Each life was measured, not by its own path, but by how well it matched the city's template. And if you strayed, the city cut you down, not always with execution, but with exile, with shame, with the slow erasure of belonging. The absurdity sharpens once you realize that individuality was never the point. You are remembered not for who you were, but for how you served. You are praised only if you vanish into the system. To modern ears, this sounds heroic, but imagine living it, never being allowed to be yourself, only being allowed to be a piece of Sparta. You would hate it, because even your triumphs belong to someone else. The cryptire ends, but its lessons do not. You return from the fields, perhaps having killed, perhaps only having watched. Either way, you are changed. You walk differently now, scanning crowds, judging silences, weighing how many helots carried a harvest. You have learned suspicion, as naturally as breathing. And this is what the city wanted. Men who no longer saw neighbours, only threats. But here is the deeper paradox. The harder the city made you, the more fragile it became. Every rite of pain, every cloak of hunger, every iron coin, all of it was designed to keep Sparta invulnerable. Yet all of it also meant that when change came from the outside world, trade, culture, new weapons, new ideas, Sparta could not adapt. Its rigidity was its strength, and also its weakness. You would hate being a Spartan because the world kept moving while your city insisted on standing still. And in that stillness, you would grow older, carrying the weight of nights in the cryptia, the taste of broth that never sweetened, the silence of rituals that never softened. The biography of your life would not read as a story of growth. It would read as a list of rehearsals for a war that never ended, a system that never released you, a city that never asked what you wanted. That is the story of a Spartan life. Not an individual tale, but a pattern pressed onto every body it touched. And that, quietly, is why you would hate being one. The stories told about Sparta often sound like parables, simple lessons carved into human bodies. They are retold because they shock, because they are sharp, but living them would be another matter. Take the boy with the fox. You already heard his ending, but the detail matters. He hid the animal under his cloak during a public gathering, silent as its claws ripped through his skin. The onlookers did not see the wound until he collapsed. To outsiders, the tale sounds like cruelty disguised as courage. To Spartans, it was the perfect illustration of discipline. Pain swallowed so completely, it could not be witnessed. If you think about it too long, you realize the absurdity. Obedience valued more than breath. You would hate living in a place where even dying quietly was considered success. Or consider the ritual at Artemis Orthia. It was not rare, not secret. Crowds gathered, priests officiated, the altar waited. Boys lined up to be whipped, sometimes until blood streamed, sometimes until consciousness broke. The audience did not intervene. They cheered silence, scorned cries, admired those who fell without complaint. Imagine your community applauding you not for living well, but for failing well. You would hate being a Spartan because your suffering was a performance you could never opt out of. Even the kings lived inside these performances. 2 monarchs, always 2, as if one were not enough. They dined at the same common tables, ate the same black broth, marched at the front of armies. Their crowns did not buy luxury. Their thrones did not guarantee safety. They could be censured by the council, accused by their peers, even exiled in disgrace. If you hated bureaucracy, here you would find royalty tangled in rules until it could barely rule at all. Kingship in Sparta was less a gift than a spotlight, bright, heavy, and unrelenting. There are anecdotes about individual kings that sharpen the absurdity. One refused to wear lavish clothes when abroad, claiming it would shame the cloak he wore at home. Another led soldiers into battle and returned to punishment for recklessness. Even when they acted boldly, their choices were trimmed to fit the state's frame. If you thought power meant freedom, Sparta would disappoint you. Power here meant scrutiny multiplied. And then there were the common soldiers, who were both feared and trapped. Each was trained from childhood to be hard. Each lived with the same cloak and the same broth. Each was told he was superior to the helot who farmed his grain. But superiority built on fear is brittle. The helots were many, the Spartans few. Every field you marched through reminded you of the imbalance. Every harvest whispered the threat of revolt. And so you lived not just in discipline, but in dread. A dread so institutionalized that the city sanctified murder as prevention. You would hate that constant background hum of anxiety, the way fear seeped into every meal and every silence. The outside world did not vanish, even if Sparta tried to block it out. Merchants passed by, travellers told stories, poets sang verses elsewhere. You might catch a rumour of a play in Athens, a new statue in Delphi, a comedy staged to laughter. But in Sparta, there was no theatre, no marble colossus, no open forum. Just drills, Syssitia, Cryptia, and the expectation that you would find fulfillment in them. You would hate the contrast, the knowledge that elsewhere joy existed, but here it was rationed down to endurance. And so, biography in Sparta was never really yours. It was the city's. From your first inspection as an infant to your last march as an elder, your story was pressed into the same mould as everyone else's. If you lived well by their measure, your name became an example. If you lived poorly, your name was erased. Individuality was not memory here, it was risk. And that is why the biographies we have are not of people, but of templates. Boys silent in pain, kings bound by rules, soldiers trained into shadows. You would hate being a Spartan, because your life would never be your own. It would always be the city's experiment. Another repetition of the same story. Another demonstration of obedience disguised as greatness. By the time you've crossed the thresholds of childhood and youth, you realize that adulthood in Sparta is not a new chapter. It is a repetition. The Agoge has finished shaping you. The Cryptia has tested you. The altar has scarred you. What remains is not freedom, but continuation. You are a soldier now, yes, but you are always being made into one. The only difference is that the city now considers you ready to be used. Your daily life looks like stability from the outside. You rise at the same hour. You join the same drills. You march with the same men. You eat in the Syssitia, the common mess, carrying your contribution so you can keep your seat. It seems routine, almost dull, but beneath that dullness is a knife. One missed contribution, and the seat is gone. One absence, and your citizenship is in question. No other Greek city tied the act of belonging so tightly to a single table. You would hate being a Spartan because every meal is a test that never ends. The food does not change. The black broth is still there, as it was when you were a boy. Its taste does not mellow with time. It remains as sharp and sour as ever, a reminder that the city does not intend for you to seek pleasure. If anything, it intends for you to forget that pleasure exists. Foreigners mocked it, Spartans defended it, but defense is not enjoyment. It is habit, drilled into you until even disgust feels normal. Your cloak too has not changed. One garment per year. It wears down with you. When it tears, you mend it. When it stiffens with sweat, you ignore it. When it fails against cold, you endure it. The cloak is both a garment and a lesson, a constant reminder that your body is not yours to indulge. You would hate the itch, the staleness, the endless repetition of fabric that should have been replaced long ago. And then there is the matter of kings. They sit above you, but not by much. 2 at a time, always 2. A double monarchy that often looked less like strength and more like compromise. They ate at the same tables, marched in the same ranks, submitted to the same scrutiny. Their crowns were symbolic, their power divided. Imagine becoming king and still needing permission for your decisions. Still dining on broth that mocked the very idea of royalty. If you thought power was a prize, Sparta would disappoint you. Power here was just another kind of cage. Stories of these kings circulate, but they are not triumphant epics. One is scolded for spending lives too freely in battle. Another is exiled for displeasing the council. Another is forced to explain why his victories cost so much. Their crowns gave them weight, but not freedom. Their biographies were written by others, measured not in choices, but in obedience. You would hate being a Spartan king as much as a Spartan soldier, because in the end both are trapped in the same net. All the while, the helots remain the background hum of your existence. They are the ones who farm, who bake, who harvest. They are the reason you can spend your life training for war instead of working the land. But they outnumber you, and that imbalance is the root of every fear. The crypteia you once served becomes the permanent reminder that fear never leaves. You patrolled fields at night, striking down those who looked too bold. You learn to live with suspicion, but suspicion is not strength, it is erosion. It eats at you quietly, until you cannot look at a field of grain without seeing rebellion hiding in the stalks. This is adulthood in Sparta. Routine on the surface, dread beneath. Discipline presented as culture. Suspicion presented as necessity. Hunger presented as strength. The city insists this is greatness. But when you count the days, when you measure what you have actually lived, it feels less like greatness and more like repetition. Every year is a loop of the same cloak, the same broth, the same drills, the same silences. And so biography in Sparta is never really biography. It is a pattern. A boy tested at birth, a youth starved into cunning, an adolescent whipped into silence, a man marched into suspicion, a king restrained by rules, a soldier tied to the same meal for life. Each stage feels like progression, but it is only another version of the same demand. Belong, obey, endure. If you hated monotony before, you would despise it here, where monotony is raised to the level of law. Perhaps the strangest part is what is missing. Other Greek cities left behind art, poetry, architecture, debate. Their citizens are remembered for words, for ideas, for creations. Sparta left behind discipline, scars, fear. Even in history, the silence is louder than the voices. What remains are fragments. An anecdote about a boy with a fox, a description of a ritual with whips, a lore about iron coins. Pieces that do not form a full picture, but do form a clear warning. This was not a place you would want to call home. You would hate being a Spartan not because every day was unbearable, but because every day was the same. A loop of hunger, silence, suspicion, obedience. A life designed to flatten difference, to strip choice, to replace comfort with ritual. A life so narrow that even memory struggles to hold it. And when at last you imagine yourself lying down as an old man, cloak stiff, body scarred, words reduced to silence, you realise what your biography has been all along. It was never your own story. It was always the city's. And the city, in the end, only valued you for how completely you disappeared into it. You walk through Sparta centuries later and find almost nothing. Stones scattered, foundations shallow, fragments of walls without grandeur. Compared to Athens with its temples, Corinth with its markets, or Delphi with its treasures, Sparta looks empty. This is not an accident. It is what the city wanted. To leave little behind was a kind of policy. If greatness was measured by monuments, Sparta chose another scale entirely. The choice shows itself in money. Gold and silver were banned. Instead, the lawgiver Lycurgus was said to have issued iron bars as currency. Heavy, brittle, dipped in vinegar, so they could not be reforged. The result was absurd. A single purchase might require a cart just to haul the payment. Foreign merchants laughed. Spartans insisted it kept greed away. If you hated carrying loose change, imagine carrying a sack of rusted rods, only to discover no one outside your city wanted them. That is why you would hate being a Spartan, because wealth here was measured in weight you could not use. The logic was always the same: to harden, to simplify, to strip. By outlawing precious metals, the city claimed to starve corruption. By banning luxury goods, it starved desire. By limiting contact with traders, it starved curiosity. To live in Sparta was to live inside a deliberate vacuum. Culture did not circulate here, it stalled. Outsiders told stories, composed songs, debated philosophies, but you did not. If you longed for colour or music, you would find only the steady march of feet in dust. The archaeology confirms it. Where other cities left colonnades and amphitheatres, Sparta left shrines that look plain, artefacts that seem utilitarian. Pottery is scarce, sculpture rare. Even coins, if they existed at all, bear none of the fineness found elsewhere. It is not that Spartans were incapable, it is that they chose not to. A marble statue might inspire pride in Athens. In Sparta, it might inspire suspicion. Beauty was not neutral, it was distraction, and distraction was weakness. So when you look for culture, you find absence. The absence is the culture. A silence where poetry might have been, a void where paintings might have hung, an emptiness where music might have echoed. This is what made Sparta famous in its own way. Other Greeks visited, noted the austerity, and left with stories of a people so dedicated to simplicity they seemed almost alien. What they saw as alien, you would feel as suffocation. Because culture is not just decoration, it is the thing that makes repetition bearable, the thing that gives rhythm to survival. Without it, life flattens. Days blend together. The cloak, the broth, the drills, all become heavier when no song, no story, no monument interrupts them. You would hate being a Spartan not only because life was harsh, but because it was deliberately stripped of beauty that might have made the harshness worth bearing. And in the corner of this silence stands another policy: restriction of foreign influence. Sparta did not want its citizens softened by outside ideas. Foreigners could visit, but traders were limited, teachers discouraged, luxuries banned. This was not a city open to the world. It was a city that braced against it. Imagine being told not to read a play, not to hear a song, not to taste a spice, because it might unbalance your discipline. You would hate being a Spartan because even curiosity was rationed. The paradox is obvious. By starving itself of culture, Sparta kept its focus on war. But by starving itself of culture, it left little behind. When the wars ended, when the soldiers were gone, the silence remained. History remembers Athens for words, Corinth for wealth, Delphi for prophecy. Sparta it remembers for absence. Iron bars no one used, empty fields, rules that erased the very traces of life. And perhaps that is the strangest legacy, a city so determined to deny luxury that it denied memory too. If you walked its ruins today, you would find only the echo of discipline, and an echo is not much to live in. You keep looking for Sparta in the soil, but the city does not easily give itself up. Archaeologists have worked the land for more than a century, turning over stones, cataloguing shards, mapping foundations. What they find again and again is not abundance but restraint. The outlines of temples are small, their walls unadorned, fragments of pottery turn up, but the patterns are plain, not the intricate red figure art of Athens. There are masks from the shrine of Artemis Orthia, thin, eerie faces pressed into clay, but they seem more like instruments of ritual than objects of beauty. The shrine of Artemis Orthia is the clearest piece of the puzzle. Here young men were whipped before crowds. The altar was a stage, but not for drama, not for poetry. It was a theatre of pain. Archaeologists found votive offerings, hundreds of them, proof that this spectacle was not a hidden cruelty, but a public one, tied to religion, tied to culture. A boy bleeding under the rod was not a failure. He was the ceremony. The city did not build marble theatres for plays, but it did build a space to make discipline visible. You would hate being a Spartan because the closest thing to public art was a scar. The mystery deepens with what is missing. Other Greek cities left libraries, inscriptions, lists of victories, treaties, decrees. Sparta left almost none. Was it because records were never made, or because they were erased? Some later writers, like Plutarch, suggested that secrecy itself was policy. It would explain the silence. If true, it means you grew up in a place where even memory was rationed. You endured hunger, cold, suspicion, and then when you died, the city allowed no voice to carry you forward. Even your story was consumed by the silence. Rumours about rituals persist in this gap. Some say the cryptire itself carried a religious edge, as if stalking helots at night was not only politics, but worship disguised. Others hint at sacrifices, or hidden rites that left little behind, either by accident or by design. No archaeologist has proven them. The dirt holds only fragments, a mask, a knife, a handful of bones that may or may not be human. But the whispers remain, as they were always meant to. If you lived in Sparta, you would not be told the whole. You would live inside secrets you could never name. You would hate that, because life already narrow would shrink further under mystery, and what does survive is plainness. Excavators describe functional tools, storage vessels, hearthstones, nothing unnecessary. If an object did not serve survival, it rarely appears. There is little colour, little ornament. Even the coins are strange. If they existed at all, they were iron, clumsy, corroded. A handful of bronze pieces turned up, but compared to the artistry of other Greek polis, they looked tired, utilitarian, indifferent. Wealth, beauty, even curiosity had been pressed flat, until only function remained. This scarcity forces you to confront what the city considered valuable, not story, not song, not monument. What mattered was discipline itself, carried not in words or images, but in bodies. A soldier was the monument. His silence was the inscription. His cloak was the sculpture. And when he died, the city did not build marble to hold his likeness. It trusted that his absence was enough. For the archaeologist, this is mystery. For you, had you lived there, it would be erasure. The effect is still felt centuries later. Walk the ruins of Athens, and you can stand in the theatre where plays once echoed. Walk Delphi, and you can still trace the path of pilgrims to the oracle. Walk Corinth, and the stones of the marketplace still speak of trade. Walk Sparta, and what you hear is a hush. The fields stretch, the Eurotas river drifts, the foundations lie shallow. The silence is heavy, but it is not peaceful. It feels deliberate, like the city is still guarding itself even after death. And perhaps that is the strangest legacy. Most civilizations try to impress the future. Sparta tried to deny it. The mystery is not what they left, but what they chose not to leave. If greatness is measured by what survives, then Sparta inverted the scale. Greatness was measured by how little survived. You would hate being a Spartan, because even your existence was meant to vanish, to dissolve into the same silence that still lingers on those hillsides. The archaeologist writes notes in a journal. The visitor takes a photograph of a stone that once mattered. But you, if you had lived there, would leave neither. You would carry discipline in your body and then disappear into the ground, leaving no record except in the fearful admiration of outsiders. And admiration, as you know by now, is not the same as memory. If you lived in most Greek cities, you would have seen markets alive with voices, stalls of olives, figs, wine, perfumes, fabrics dyed deep red or purple. You would have heard accents from distant ports, travellers sharing news of wars, sailors telling stories of storms. Even if you were not a trader, the market gave rhythm to your days. But in Sparta, the market was not the heart of life. It barely existed. The laws discouraged trade. Luxury was frowned upon. Foreign merchants could come, but their influence was trimmed. You were not encouraged to buy what they offered, and they were not encouraged to stay. Gold and silver coins, the tokens of wealth across the Mediterranean, were forbidden. You were left with iron lumps, too heavy to carry far, too worthless to attract outsiders. This was not simply inconvenience, it was design. The city did not want you softened by foreign goods or foreign thoughts. To live in Sparta was to live behind invisible walls. You would hate that, because walls without doors are not safety, they are prison. The consequences shaped even small things. A child in Athens might grow up with a wooden toy carved in bright paint. A child in Corinth might see jewellery sparkling at a festival. A child in Sparta grew up with a single cloak, a bowl of black broth, and the expectation that anything more would weaken him. Foreign luxuries were not temptations. They were banished phantoms, spoken of only as warnings. You would hate being a Spartan because even imagination was policed. Isolation also meant ignorance. Plays performed in Athens were never staged in your city. Philosophers debating under colonnades were never invited here. Musicians with strange instruments never performed in your streets. You lived in a place that prided itself on resisting influence. But the result was not purity, it was emptiness. You knew how to march, how to strike, how to stay silent. But you did not know the lines of Homer beyond what was drilled into you, nor the debates of Socrates, nor the laughter of Aristophanes. To outsiders, this made you look austere. To you, it would feel like absence. Even food carried the mark of this isolation. Other cities experimented, mixed spices from trade, tasted fruits brought from distant islands. You had the same barley, the same wine, the same black broth. Variety itself was treated as dangerous. The unfamiliar was not novelty, it was corruption. And so your meals, your songs, your words, your very life remained as narrow as the valley that held your city. Some modern readers imagine this simplicity as strength, less distraction, more focus. But the truth of living it would feel different. Simplicity imposed is not clarity, it is reduction. Your life would shrink until it fit into the frame the city allowed. One cloak, one dish, one set of words, one purpose. If you hated monotony, you would hate it most here, where monotony was praised as virtue. And yet, the paradox is sharp. Sparta's isolation made it feared in its time, but it also made it fragile. While Athens grew rich from trade, while Corinth built fleets, while Ionia experimented with philosophy, Sparta repeated the same drills, the same silence, the same suspicion. When change finally came, the city could not bend. It had forgotten how. A society trained to resist influence eventually collapsed under its own rigidity. You would hate being a Spartan because even the world beyond your walls was withheld from you. Curiosity was suspect. Exchange was weakness. Colour was indulgence. Your neighbours built civilizations that sang. Yours built one that hushed itself into a corner. And that silence was not strength. It was the slow suffocation of culture. If you walked through that silence, you would not find mystery waiting. You would find only the echo of what was denied. Walk through the land where Sparta once stood, and you are struck less by ruins than by spaces. There are hillsides where temples might have been, but the foundations lie low and undecorated. There are plains where theatres could have risen, but only earth and stones remain. There are shrines, yes, but they feel modest, almost shy, as if the city did not want to call attention to itself. You realise, slowly, that this is not a case of history erasing glory. It is a case of glory never being expressed in the first place. Athens still greets you with marble. Corinth still hums with the echoes of trade. Delphi still whispers with oracles. Sparta, by contrast, greets you with absence. The city that terrified its neighbours, the city that trained its children with hunger, left almost nothing to stand against the centuries. If you hated emptiness, you would hate this most of all, because Sparta managed to make even its memory austere. The absence was deliberate. Gold and silver coins were banned. Decorative luxury was distrusted. Public art was minimized. Records were scarce. This was not a city that wanted to impress the future with monuments. It was a city that wanted to impress discipline onto the present. Its real architecture was the human body, trained, scarred, silenced. Its real monuments were not columns but routines. The same cloak, the same broth, the same drills. And when those bodies died, the monuments went with them. What archaeologists do find is telling. Masks from the shrine of Artemis Orthia, thin clay faces, unnerving in their simplicity. Fragments of tools and vessels that speak of utility, not ornament. A few inscriptions, laconic and restrained. A city that could carve marble like its neighbours chose instead to leave clay and silence. This was not incompetence, it was ideology. To love art was to risk softness. To love beauty was to risk distraction. And distraction, they believed, led to weakness. You would hate living under that belief, because even your desire to create something gentle would be branded as betrayal. Rumours fill the gaps left behind. Some whisper of hidden rites, mysteries tied to the cryptia, or obscure sacrifices carried out in darkness. Others speculate that records once existed, only to be deliberately destroyed. The truth is uncertain, and the uncertainty itself feels like part of the plan. Sparta did not need the world to know its secrets. It needed its citizens not to ask. Imagine living your whole life inside rituals you cannot explain, with ceremonies performed because they have always been performed, with no story allowed to soften them. You would hate that, not because ritual is strange, but because ritual without meaning is emptiness disguised as devotion. Foreigners noticed this void more than Spartans did. Visitors from Athens or later Rome walked away puzzled, sometimes amused. They mocked the iron money, describing lumps of rust that no merchant wanted. They gagged at the black broth, insisting it tasted like despair in a bowl. They marvelled at the flogging rituals, shocked that a city could turn a suffering into spectacle. And yet they wrote it all down. That is why we know Sparta today. The city itself left little. Its neighbours filled the silence with their stories. In effect, your reputation was outsourced. Even your legacy was not your own. You would hate that, knowing that when history remembered you, it would be through the eyes of those who never lived your life. What makes this harsher is that absence does not give you freedom. It gives you monotony, a cloak repeated each year, meals stripped of flavour, days stripped of variation, culture stripped of colour. You march, you drill, you eat, you sleep. Nothing interrupts the cycle. In Athens, a festival might bring music. In Corinth, a ship might arrive with strange goods. In Ionia, a new idea might spark debate. In Sparta, the closest thing to entertainment is watching boys whipped at an altar. You would hate the claustrophobia of that silence, a silence not peaceful, but grinding. Even memory itself bends under the pressure. Your biography, should you have one, is not a tale of individuality. It is another iteration of the Spartan mould, tested at birth, hardened in youth, silenced in pain, erased in death. What survives of you is not your voice, but the city's claim upon it. Archaeologists may find the clay mask you once wore during a ritual. They may find the iron coin you held. They may find the altar where your back bled. But they will not find your story. Sparta never intended to preserve it. And so the cultural mystery of Sparta is not what it created, but what it chose not to create. It is remembered for absence, for silence, for discipline carried so far that it erased even beauty. That absence still unsettles visitors today. Standing among the plain stones, they feel the weight of what is not there. The silence feels deliberate, almost defensive, as if the city is still guarding itself against softness, even long after its people are gone. You would hate being a Spartan, because culture here was not a canvas but a cage. What could have been art was stripped into utility. What could have been history was trimmed into fragments. What could have been memory was left unspoken. A society that feared luxury so much that it chose silence over song leaves nothing for you to hold on to except the knowledge that you endured discipline for its own sake. And when you walk away from the ruins, the feeling lingers. You have not just visited a city, you have visited an absence. That absence was their culture. An absence, however disciplined, is not much of a life. That is the paradox of Sparta, and that is why, quietly but unmistakably, you would hate being one of them. To understand Sparta, you cannot begin with the soldier. You must begin with the people who never wore the red cloak, who never ate in the mess hall, who never had a voice in the assembly. They were the helots. They worked the land, harvested the crops, carried the burdens. They were not a small household class. They were the majority. Every loaf of bread a Spartan citizen ate, every cup of wine he drank, every cloak he wore, all of it was produced by helot labour. If you lived in Sparta, you lived on their backs, and yet you were told not to think of them as neighbours. The helots were not simply servants. They were state property, attached to the soil, bound to produce. They could not be sold abroad, and they could not buy their freedom. They remained generation after generation, a constant reminder that the wealth of the city, thin as it was, rested on their labour. Other Greek polis had slaves, yes, but none in such numbers, none with such permanence. In Athens, a slave might come from war, from trade, from capture, and he could be sold again. In Sparta, the helot population was rooted. You could never imagine the city without them. But numbers cut both ways, because the helots outnumbered the Spartan citizens several times over. Some say 6-1, some say even more. The exact ratio is debated, but the fear was constant. When you walked through the fields, you did not simply see crops, you saw the possibility of rebellion. Every harvest was a reminder that those you relied on most were also the ones you feared most. That fear shaped the entire constitution of the city. The solution was not generosity, not inclusion, it was violence. The cryptaia made that clear. Each year, the ephors, those magistrates who oversaw much of civic life, would declare war on the helots. It was a legal fiction, a ritual gesture, but its meaning was real. It gave cover for young Spartan men to move through the countryside with knives and kill. Not random slaughter, but selective. The strongest helots, the proudest, those who stood a little taller, who spoke with too much confidence, these were marked as threats. The cryptaia hunted them. Death came quietly, at night, with no trial and no record. If you imagine yourself as one of those young men, you see the cost. At 16 or 17, you're told to sleep in the open, barefoot, surviving off the land. You're told to learn silence, to stalk, to wait. And you're told that the measure of your discipline is not only endurance, but killing. The first blood you spill is not against an enemy in battle, but against your own population. If you imagine yourself as a helot, the fear is worse. A face you do not know, a shadow in the night, a knife at your throat. Not because you disobeyed, but because you stood too straight. This is not incidental cruelty. It is systemic. It was meant to keep the balance of power tipped, to remind the helots that they were always watched, always at risk. Terror was not an accident of the system. It was the system. You would hate being a Spartan because your life, whichever side you were on, was entangled in this cycle of suspicion. If you were a citizen, you were trained to kill silently in order to preserve your status. If you were a helot, you lived under the certainty that dignity itself could be fatal. And the tension did not end with the crypteia. It shaped every household. When you sat at the communal table, you knew the food before you came from hands that despised you. When you lay down in the barracks, you knew that your family's survival depended on keeping that despised population in line. Every law, every ritual, every suspicion pointed back to the same truth. Sparta was a fortress turned inward, a city at permanent war with itself. The paradox runs deep. Sparta is often remembered for equality among its citizens, for the austere balance of its constitution, for the way men of wealth and men of modest means shared the same mess hall. But that equality existed only because a vast, unequal population supported it. The red cloak of the soldier, the iron currency, the austere meals. None of these would have been possible if someone else were not working the soil. The so-called freedom of the Spartiate was built directly on the unfreedom of the helot. If you had lived there, you would feel that paradox in daily life. When you looked across the fields, you would see not just barley and vines, but the eyes of those who tilled them. When you heard the whispers at night, you would wonder if it was wind in the reeds, or the silent feet of the crypteia. When you saw the faces of helots in the market, you would see not individuals, but potential threats. The fear was constant, woven into every interaction, and fear, lived day after day, is exhausting. That exhaustion explains much about the character of the city, the obsession with discipline, with silence, with austerity. It was all armour, not just against foreign enemies, but against the population inside the walls. To live in Sparta was to live in a state of siege, even in times of peace. You would hate it, because even when the wars ended, the tension never did. And when centuries passed and the city itself declined, that silence remained in the soil. Archaeologists uncover bones, tools, traces of huts, but the shadow of that fear lingers. It is not simply the memory of battle that defines Sparta. It is the memory of a society that lived afraid of its own foundation. That, quietly but unmistakably, is why you would hate being a Spartan. Marriage in Sparta did not follow the patterns you would expect in other Greek cities. In Athens, for instance, weddings were ceremonial affairs with processions, feasts, and the display of dowries. In Sparta, the ritual was stripped down, almost inverted. The bride's head was shaved. She was dressed not in fine clothing, but in men's garments. Then she was hidden away in a dark room, waiting. The groom would not move into the house, nor would he live openly with her at first. Instead, he would sneak in at night, visit her in secrecy, and slip away again to return to the barracks where he slept with his comrades. The logic was that secrecy sharpened desire, that restraint made the bond stronger. But imagine living inside that arrangement. Your wedding night is not a celebration, not a feast, not the gathering of family. It is a performance of absence. You are taken, altered, hidden. You see your husband only in fragments of time, in shadows, as if the state itself were afraid to let intimacy breathe in daylight. You would hate being a Spartan because even marriage, the place where most people expect stability, was treated like another drill. This arrangement was not short. Men lived in barracks until well into their 30s. A young husband might have children before he ever lived openly with his wife. Daily life was not shared meals or household routines. It was quick meetings in the dark, a child conceived between duties, and then the separation continued. A household in Sparta was never just a private matter. It was controlled, delayed, bent to serve the needs of the military order, and the system extended further. If the city thought a marriage was not producing strong enough children, it allowed intervention. A man could be encouraged to lend his wife to another, stronger citizen to ensure the birth of robust offspring. This was not scandalous in their eyes. It was civic duty. The individual bond between two people mattered less than the health of the city's future soldiers. To live in such a world meant accepting that even your most private relationship was not truly yours. You would hate that, because intimacy here was not a sanctuary. It was an assignment. The irony is that while men lived half lives between barracks and secret visits, women carried unusual economic power. Spartan women could inherit property, could own land, could manage estates while the men were away. In many Greek cities, women were confined, kept indoors, their names barely mentioned in public records. In Sparta, women's voices carried farther. But the paradox is sharp. Their influence in economics did not free them from the rituals of marriage, or from being treated as vessels for the state's military future. Strength in one area was counterbalanced by constraint in another. Daily life in such households was unlike anything elsewhere in Greece. Children were not raised with indulgence. A boy was taken from home at age 7 to live in the Agoge. A girl was trained in athletics, in running and wrestling, her body prepared for the expectation of childbirth as much as for personal health. Family bonds were deliberately thinned because the city wanted loyalty directed toward the collective, not the home. A father did not raise his son. A mother did not see him daily. The household was only a temporary stop before the state claimed the child. This was Sparta's way of ensuring that no individual bond grew stronger than civic duty. But the cost was high. The warmth of ordinary domestic life was absent. Meals were eaten in common messes, not in private kitchens. Marriages were hidden. Children were surrendered. The home existed, but it was hollowed out, its rhythms broken apart by the demands of discipline. If you imagine yourself in this world, you would feel the strangeness every day. You would walk past houses without laughter, without gatherings, without the warmth of extended family. You would live a marriage not in companionship, but in fragments. You would see children disappear into the barracks and know they no longer belonged fully to you. You would hate being a Spartan because even the walls of your own house could not protect you from the city's demands. And when you step back to see the pattern, you notice that private life was never allowed to grow naturally. It was bent, cut, reshaped until it fit the frame of discipline. In most places, the home is a place of retreat. In Sparta, it was just another outpost of the state. That, quietly, is why daily life here felt less like living and more like rehearsing. In most Greek cities, women were kept indoors. Their names rarely appear in inscriptions. Their voices rarely carried in public. Property flowed through men, and legal guardianship remained a constant. But Sparta was different. Here, women could inherit, could own land, could manage estates in their own right. When men spent their lives in the barracks, it was women who kept the household property intact. Over time, this power grew so large that by the 4th century, observers claimed Spartan women controlled nearly 2/5 of the land. To outsiders, this looked scandalous. Philosophers muttered that Spartan women were too free, too bold. They walked outside without veils. They spoke in public. They gave commands. For men from Athens, where women were hidden away, the sight was almost unthinkable. But within Sparta, this arrangement was practical. If the men were never home, someone had to run the estates. If the city demanded soldiers, someone had to preserve the wealth that fed them. The result was that women carried influence unusual in the Greek world. Yet this influence came with strange costs. From childhood, Spartan girls were trained not in weaving or domestic crafts, but in athletics. They ran races, wrestled, threw the discus, sang songs of competition. Their bodies were hardened, their lungs expanded, their skin tanned. The reasoning was blunt. Strong mothers produce strong children. A girl's muscles were a civic investment. Her body was not her own. It was the city's preparation for the next generation of soldiers. Imagine growing up under such expectation. You are praised for strength, for stamina, for boldness, but always the praise is tied to future childbirth, to the hope that you will give Sparta more warriors. You train not for your own sake, but as rehearsal for someone else's life. That is why you would hate being a Spartan. Even freedom here was conditional, always tethered to the city's needs. The paradox deepens when you compare men and women. Spartan men were reduced by discipline. They ate broth without flavour. They wore one cloak until it thinned. They drilled endlessly in silence. Their lives narrowed into obedience. Spartan women, by contrast, seemed expansive. They moved freely, spoke loudly, owned property, commanded estates. Outsiders saw this and assumed they were liberated. But liberation without intimacy, without the freedom to live privately, is not full freedom. Their marriages were still arranged within the logic of the state. Their children were still surrendered to the Agoge. Their voices carried weight, but their lives were still bent toward the same end, the preservation of discipline. Even their reputations carried contradiction. A Spartan woman was admired for boldness, feared for sharpness of tongue, resented for wealth. Foreign writers sometimes treated them as curiosities, symbols of a city turned upside down. And inside Sparta, their authority sometimes caused friction. Men who spent their lives obeying commands in barracks returned to find their wives not submissive, but commanding. The household was not a retreat, but another battlefield, where the balance of influence was unsettled. This unsettledness extended to motherhood. A famous line attributed to them, whether true or not, was that a Spartan mother, handing her son a shield, told him to return with it or on it. In other words, victorious or dead. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the sentiment fit the system. Women were expected not only to produce soldiers, but to harden themselves against grief. To mourn too much was weakness. To prefer your son's life to the city's survival was betrayal. Imagine carrying that weight. Your pride in your child turned into a measure of your loyalty to discipline. You would hate that, because even love itself was conscripted. The effect is stark. In other Greek cities, women were silenced, but homes were full of family bonds. In Sparta, women had voices, but the home was hollow. Power without intimacy, influence without sanctuary. The city gave women land, movement, and speech, but it took from them the simple right to hold their family close. So when you think of women in Sparta, do not picture liberation. Picture a body trained for childbirth, a voice sharpened by necessity, an estate managed in absence, and a grief hidden under discipline. You would hate being a Spartan because even in the place where the city seemed most unusual, most progressive, the same pattern held. Everything bent back to the service of the state. Freedom that is always conditional is not freedom. It is just another kind of chain, polished to look like power. To eat in Sparta was not a private act. It was not a family gathering around a hearth, nor a host inviting friends into his home. In Sparta, meals were taken in the syssitia, the common mess. Groups of men bound together ate the same food at the same tables. The food itself was simple, almost defiant in its austerity. Barley bread, cheese, figs, and above all, the famous black broth made from pig's blood, vinegar, and salt. Outsiders gagged at the taste. To Spartans, it was proof of endurance. Participation in these common meals was not optional. It was the mark of citizenship itself. A Spartan man who could not contribute his share of food to the mess was excluded, and exclusion was devastating. It meant not just hunger, it meant the loss of status. You could not eat with your peers, and therefore you could not live as one of them. In effect, you lost your citizenship. Imagine losing your entire civic identity because you failed to provide barley or wine. You would hate being a Spartan because even your right to belong was tied to constant contribution with no margin for failure. The Syssitia was designed to erase individuality. You ate what everyone else ate, in the same space, in the same way. No one feasted in private. No one displayed wealth through delicacies. The message was clear: equality through reduction. But equality achieved by cutting away comfort is not relief. It is pressure. Every bite reminded you of the city's control. Every absence of flavour reminded you that indulgence was forbidden. And this extended beyond meals. Clothing was rationed. 1 cloak per year, regardless of whether or where. Bathing was infrequent. Ornament was mocked. You were expected to appear plain, indistinguishable from the man beside you. It was not enough to fight together. You had to look alike, eat alike, live alike. Individual choice was not celebrated. It was erased. Even leisure carried weight. Festivals did not mean freedom. They meant displays of discipline. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, boys were flogged before the crowd, sometimes until they collapsed, sometimes until they died. It was presented as ritual, as a test, as devotion. But imagine watching it, year after year, knowing it could have been you or your son or your brother. Entertainment was not laughter, not music, not theatre. Entertainment was pain sanctified in public. You would hate being a Spartan because even joy was stolen, replaced by endurance dressed as ceremony. The city's social fabric was tight, but it was not warm. Men ate together, drilled together, slept together in barracks. Women managed estates but lived with absence. Children were raised by the state, not their parents. Helots laboured under suspicion, always near but never included. Each layer of society was bound, not by affection, but by necessity and fear. To outsiders, this looked admirable. A community where wealth was flattened, where indulgence was suppressed, where men stood as equals in the mess hall. But from within, the cost was clear. Equality was not generosity, it was compulsion. If you could not endure the same cloak, the same broth, the same silence, you were cast out. Belonging was never a gift. It was a test you had to pass again and again. This is the core of Sparta's social system. Everything was interlocked. The barracks, the mess halls, the land worked by helots, the estates managed by women, the rituals of pain, the inspections of children. No sphere of life escaped the city's reach. You could not eat, love, mourn, or rest without the state bending the act into its shape. So when you think of being a Spartan, do not think only of the warrior with shield and spear. Think of the man in the mess hall, gagging down broth he cannot escape. Think of the woman inheriting land she cannot turn into freedom. Think of the helot watching fields, while knowing he may not survive the night. Think of the boy taken from home, raised among strangers, learning that hunger is natural and affection is weakness. You would hate being a Spartan because here, society did not support life. It consumed it. Every bond was thinned, every comfort denied, every choice trimmed down until only the city's demands remained. What passed for community was not sharing, but surveillance. What passed for equality was not trust, but discipline. And when all of it is placed together, the meals, the marriages, the households, the fields, you see not a society at peace with itself, but one perpetually tightened, like a rope pulled to breaking. The rope held for centuries, but to live inside it meant living in tension, every day, with no release. That is the Sparta beneath the legend, a place where even eating together became a burden. And that, quietly but unavoidably, is why you would have hated it